So when we talk about Kenya's independence, it's not like it was just one single event. It was a 70-year fight, a struggle that literally evolved through generations. We're going to break this epic story down into three main acts, starting with the very first spears of resistance, moving to the political battles fought all the way in London, and then finally into the forest war that really forced the hand of an entire empire. You really can't understand this story without starting right here, in 1884. And this idea that Africa was just a farm to harvest, that wasn't just some throwaway line. That was the entire philosophy behind colonialism. It defined the people who lived there not as, inhabitants, but as resources. And that single idea set in motion a conflict that would rage for almost 75 years. So the Berlin Conference of 1884, this is where that whole twisted idea becomes official policy. You have these European powers literally drawing lines on a map of a continent they barely understood, with absolutely no regard for the people, the cultures, or the nations that already existed there. The land that we now call Kenya was just handed over to the British. And for everyone living there, that meant their home was now officially the property of a foreign power. But this wasn't some passive thing where people just accepted it. Not at all. The immediate response to the invasion was armed conflict. This first phase, which we can call the Age of Waiyaki, wasn't about politics or writing letters. It was about meeting invaders on the battlefield with spears and defending your ancestral land. And look, this wasn't just one group in one place. Resistance popped up pretty much everywhere, almost immediately. You had Mbarek Rashid leading the charge in Mombasa. Down in Taita, it was Mgeka. The Giriama were led by an incredible warrior, Me Katili Wa. And of course, Waiyaki was fighting in central Kenya. These weren't all coordinated like a modern army, but they were all fighting for the exact same thing, to defend their homes. So how did the colonial forces respond to this? Well, it wasn't by talking or trying to find some middle ground. The policy was simple: crush it. It was a policy of total subjugation, using overwhelming military force to break any and all resistance. The goal was to establish absolute control, no matter what the human cost. And if you want to understand just how brutal this was, you don't have to guess. We have it right here in a colonial officer's own words from his diary in 1902. He wrote, quote, "I gave orders that every living thing should be killed without mercy. Every soul was either shot or bayoneted." This wasn't just warfare. This was a documented, systematic campaign of terror, and it was designed not just to defeat the resistance, but to completely annihilate the will to ever fight back again. Okay. So when you're facing that kind of overwhelming, brutal force, when your spear is up against a machine gun, that initial armed resistance was eventually crushed. But the fight? Oh, it was far from over. So that brings up the big question. When open warfare fails, what do? How does the struggle for freedom adapt and evolve? Right, so the fight moves. It shifts from the battlefield into the political world. This next phase, what you could call the Age of Kenyatta, wasn't defined by weapons. It was defined by words, by organization, and by a whole new kind of activism through political groups. And things started happening fast. In 1921, you get the East African Association, formed to fight for African rights. The colonial government bans it, of course. But what happens? 2 years later, the Kikuyu Central Association just rises up to take its place. This constant pressure eventually forces the British to do something, which leads to this huge flashpoint in 1932, the Carter Land Commission. You have to understand, land was everything. It was the central issue. And the Carter Land Commission was the colonial government's supposed answer. But it wasn't about justice. It was basically a legal tool to make the theft of the best, most fertile lands official, creating what became known as the White Highlands for settlers. The source calls it a conspiracy of hyenas and wolves, and that pretty much tells you exactly how Kenyans saw it. When they couldn't get justice at home, what did? They took the fight straight to the heart of the empire itself. Leaders like Jomo Kenyatta actually traveled to London. They wrote books, they lobbied politicians, they worked day and night to tell the world what was happening in Kenya, hoping that maybe, just maybe, international pressure could force a change. But here's the thing. After decades of trying the political route, of writing letters and lobbying and getting pretty much nowhere, patience just ran out. And that brings us to the third and by far the most explosive phase of the struggle, the Age of Kimathi. All that frustration boiled over into a full-blown guerrilla war, fought from the shadows of the forests. This was the final, violent push for liberation. And this next phase was sealed with an incredibly powerful oath. The fighters, in what the British called the Mau Mau movement, took this pledge, dedicating their entire lives to one single goal, to get their land back and win their freedom, by any means necessary. An oath like this, it completely transformed a political movement into a revolutionary war. The military force behind this uprising was the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, or the KLFA. It was led by a brilliant military strategist, Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi. They used the incredibly dense forests and mountains as their sanctuary and their base of operations, launching guerrilla strikes against the colonial regime. What you end up with is this classic David versus Goliath situation, a totally asymmetrical war. On one side, you've got the KLFA, with their homemade guns and spears, but they have this unbreakable resolve, and they know the terrain like the back of their hand. And on the other side, you have the full might of the British Empire. We're talking professional soldiers, modern rifles, machine guns, even bombers. So how does the colonial government react to a full-blown guerrilla war? With absolute force. On October 20th, 1952, they declared a state of emergency. Now, this wasn't just some political declaration. It was basically a green light for total war against the population. It meant mass arrests, thousands of people forced into detention camps, and it gave them the power to kill suspects without a trial. The violence just escalated to a terrifying new level. And this is maybe the most important part of the whole story. Militarily, on the battlefield, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army was eventually defeated. But in the grand scheme of things, they won. The war was so brutal, so expensive in terms of lives, money, and Britain's reputation on the world stage that it completely shattered their will to hold on to the colony. The war in the forest, even though it was lost militarily, is what forced the empire to the negotiating table. And after that, things moved surprisingly fast. In 1956, Dedan Kimathi was captured and later executed, which was a huge symbolic blow to the armed fight. But the political damage was done. Just 4 years later, you have Kenyan leaders in London, not as subjects begging for rights, but as negotiators hammering out the future of their country at the Lancaster House Conference. And then, in 1963, after a 70-year struggle, the Kenyan flag was finally raised over an independent nation. So, when you look at the whole thing, from the very first spears thrown by Waiyaki's generation, through the political maneuvering of Kenyatta's era, all the way to Kimathi's war in the forests, you're looking at a 70-year saga, a relentless, multi-generational fight for land, for dignity, and for the basic right to decide your own future. And that really leaves us with a huge question, doesn't it? The legacy of a fight like this is incredibly complex. When a country is forged in that kind of fire, born out of that much violence, out of such a long struggle for the very land under its feet, how does that shape its identity, its politics, and its very definition of what freedom even means for all the generations that come after? That's definitely something to think about.